The rain in Blackwood Creek didn't fall. It hammered. Detective Elias Thorne, a man whose face was etched with the silent histories of the last decade's grime and despair, watched the water streak the window of Precinct 413. The station was a brutalist concrete relic, smelling perpetually of stale coffee, old paper, and a faint, metallic coppery scent that Thorne refused to assign a name to. Thorne wasn't a hero, just a man whose internal alarm clock was permanently set to 3 a.m. He was the head of the Cold Cases and Anomalies Unit, a glorified desk job where the anomalies were mostly bureaucratic and the cold cases were just waiting for the next generation to forget them. Blackwood Creek was meant to be the end of the line, a quiet burial for a weary detective. That night, the quiet was violently interrupted. It was 2:47 a.m. The only other person awake was Officer Lena Reyes, a sharp, skeptical rookie who preferred true crime podcasts to actual police work, sitting across the room scrolling on her phone. The dispatch radio crackled, the sound unnaturally loud in the empty silence. 413. We have a possible 10 to 54, maybe a 10 to 56. Caller is hysterical. Location, the old Kilkenny Farm on Route 17. Repeat, Kilkenny Farm. Thorne sighed, rubbing his tired eyes. Kilkenny Farm, an abandoned, half-burned-out husk of a place, notorious for decades of local ghost stories about missing children and a fire that, according to lore, only burned the flesh, not the wood. Reyes, suit up. Let's go check on the local loony. Thorne mumbled, already grabbing his jacket. Reyes looked up, a flicker of something unsettling in her eyes. Detective, the Kilkenny Farm? Isn't that the place where the only person who lived was a kid who claimed the black fog ate his whole family? Thorne shot her a look. Yeah, well, the kid grew up, got institutionalized, and the only thing Blackwood Creek has eaten lately is my retirement fund. Now move. The scene, Kilkenny Farm. The farm was exactly how the rumors described it. Desolate, shadowed by gnarled, sickly-looking oak trees, and surrounded by a gate of rusted, spear-like iron. The rain had intensified, and the air here was colder, somehow thicker, than downtown. The 911 caller was waiting on the porch, rocking back and forth. An older man named Mr. Callahan, a retired history teacher who lived in the closest house, half a mile away. She's gone. They're all gone. Callahan sobbed, pointing a trembling finger toward the dilapidated main house. My neighbor, Mrs. Alcott. She heard a scream, a horrible, scraping sound, and went to check on her dog, Buster. 5 minutes later, the lights in her house just went out. I drove over. Her front door was open. I called her name. The only thing I heard back was a whisper, not a voice, a sound like wet, black smoke. Thorne exchanged a look with Reyes. A whisper like wet, black smoke. This wasn't a break-in. This was something else. They approached Mrs. Alcott's small, tidy bungalow adjacent to the farm property. The front door stood ajar, rocking slightly in the wind. Inside, everything was disturbingly normal. A half-finished cup of tea sat on the kitchen counter. The television in the living room was still playing an infomercial for cleaning supplies, the volume muted. Reyes knelt beside a small, expensive-looking ceramic water bowl near the fireplace. Detective, Mrs. Alcott's dog, Buster? He's gone. No sign of a struggle, no paw prints in the mud outside. It's like he just vanished. Thorne was already in the hallway. He stopped dead. The hallway was long and dark, leading to the bedrooms. But it wasn't the darkness that stopped him. It was the temperature. It plummeted by at least 20 degrees. He could see his own breath. He pulled his flashlight, its beams swallowed by the oppressive gloom. He shined it down the hall. Reyes, standing right behind him, gasped, clutching her sidearm. On the pale, floral wallpaper, 3 feet above the baseboard, was a single, perfect handprint. It wasn't blood. It wasn't mud. It was a stain of pure, oily, inky blackness. It looked like someone had dipped their hand into engine oil and pressed it against the wall, but the substance was still wet. Thorne took a step closer, his stomach tightening into a knot. Look closer, Reyes, he whispered, his voice catching in his throat. The handprint wasn't just a stain. It had depth. It was almost three-dimensional, like the substance had actively etched the outline of a human hand into the drywall. But the worst detail was the one that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up, making him feel that old, primal fear he hadn't felt since his rookie days in the city. The hand had 6 fingers. "It's the Black Fog, Detective," Reyes breathed, her voice barely a whisper. "It's how the legend starts." The hook. Thorne ignored her. He was a professional. He shined the flashlight beam across the floor, looking for Mrs. Alcott. Nothing. He shined it to the ceiling. And there, above them, near the entrance to the attic crawlspace, was another stain. Smaller this time, perhaps a footprint, but the same suffocating black ink. Then, the static from Reyes's sidearm radio screamed. Not a sound from dispatch, but a sharp, high-pitched electronic shriek. Reyes reflexively dropped the radio. From the hallway came a sound that scraped against the very walls of the house. It wasn't a growl. It wasn't a human scream. It was a long, dragging, wet-sucking noise, like the sound of a vacuum being turned on in a flooded basement. The cold intensified further. Thorne's lungs burned. The only light was his struggling flashlight beam. Shukiyukuk. He heard the creak of an old floorboard from the darkness of the hallway. Something was moving toward them. Something heavy. Something wet. Thorne pulled his service weapon, adrenaline flooding his system, and pointed it at the end of the hall, where the temperature was now below freezing. "Police. Show yourself," he yelled. His voice sounded thin, frail, and useless. The sucking sound stopped. The silence that followed was worse. Reyes, her breath coming in ragged gasps, tugged hard on Thorne's sleeve. "Detective, the ceiling. Look at the air vent." Thorne raised the beam. From the vent in the ceiling, a thin, wispy curl of black, sooty, oily vapor, identical to the substance of the 6-fingered handprint, was beginning to snake its way out, smelling strongly of ozone and burnt metal. It dropped, coiling and pooling, growing thicker and larger, until it hung suspended in the air, a small, spinning vortex of absolute blackness, right above the spot where Mrs. Alcott's dog bowl had sat. Thorne felt a sudden, profound, crushing weight of dread. This wasn't a perp. This was wrong. As the black vortex began to descend, Thorne heard a faint, rasping sound coming from within the swirling darkness. A whisper. It was Mrs. Alcott's voice. "The Black Fog. It remembers the heat." Thorne fired a single shot at the coalescing mass, the noise deafening in the small room. The bullet disappeared into the blackness with a wet, flat thwomp. The black fog didn't dissipate. It simply stopped descending and looked at them. The vague shape of a 6-fingered appendage began to reach out from the center of the vortex. "Run! Get out! Now!" Thorne roared, shoving Reyes toward the front door. As they scrambled back out into the hammering rain, Thorne risked a final look back. The black mass was now fully formed, standing a hulking 7 feet tall in the hallway. It had no discernible features, just an oscillating, oily shape, except for one detail. In the center of its mass, like a single, malignant eye, was a faint, orange glow, the color of embers, focused directly on them. The sound of the sucking returned, louder this time, and the windows of the bungalow began to rattle violently. Thorne slammed the front door shut, the impact startling the hysterical Mr. Callahan. "They're gone, Mr. Callahan. They're gone," Thorne shouted, dragging Reyes away from the porch. "Who, detective? Who's gone?" Callahan whimpered. Thorne didn't answer. He knew the truth. Mrs. Alcott wasn't gone from the house. She was gone into the black fog. He looked back at the bungalow. The orange ember glow behind the front window was now brighter, pulsating with malevolent energy. This wasn't a cold case. This was a war against something that shouldn't exist, and it had just declared its opening move by taking the first victim right at the site of its own myth. The black fog had returned, and Detective Elias Thorne had just walked straight into the cold, oily heart of it. They didn't stop until the tires of the unmarked Crown Victoria hit the slick asphalt of Precinct 413's parking lot. The concrete fortress felt less like a police station and more like a flimsy shelter now. The hammering rain of Blackwood Creek hadn't followed them. It seemed to have been a private storm for the Kilkenny Farm. Detective Thorne, soaked to the bone, walked into the station and immediately threw his jacket onto the back of his chair. It landed with a heavy thud, making a dark puddle on the linoleum floor. Reyes looked physically ill, leaning against the door frame, her breath still ragged. "Clean yourselves up, Reyes," Thorne ordered, his voice flat, devoid of the usual weariness. It was replaced by a strange, icy clarity. "We have a 10 to 56 to log." "Sir, we don't have a 10 to 56, Reyes stammered, pulling off her rain-sodden gloves. "We have a myth. A six-fingered handprint on a wall, a talking patch of smoke, and a missing elderly woman swallowed by a wet vacuum cleaner sound." Thorne turned, his eyes fixed on hers. "We have a missing person, officer. Mrs. Alcott. She went missing from her home. We investigate missing persons. We don't log wet black smoke. You saw a localized electrical surge, probably an ozone spike, and a heat-activated chemical reaction on old drywall that simulated a shape. End of report." Reyes knew he was lying. Not to her, but to the cold, rational world he needed to cling to. She nodded slowly. "Right. A localized electrical surge with a six-fingered handprint. Did you get photos?" Reyes pulled out her phone, her hand shaking. "I did. The moment I saw it, I snapped 3. Look." Thorne took the phone. The image on the screen, even rendered in low light and compressed data, was undeniable. The black stain was a perfect impression of a human hand, the ink-like substance still glistening, and the unmistakable 6th digit next to the thumb. "Print these," Thorne instructed, handing the phone back. "And only these. No mention of the heat, the sound, or the whisper. Just a strange black residue. Now, go file the missing person report." The file room. While Reyes was in the report-writing room, Thorne headed for the station's grimy archives, a cramped, subterranean room that housed the ghosts of every unsolved case since the precinct opened. He was looking for the original file on the Kilkenny Farm incident, the Black Fog case. The file was brittle, yellowed, and smelled of mold and ash. Case file, 1983-047 victims. The Kilkenny family, father, mother, 10-year-old twin daughters. Survivor, Samuel Kilkenny, 8 years old. Cause of death, undetermined. Bodies never found. The house fire was later ruled arson, but the source was never identified. Thorne opened the survivor's statement from 1983. He remembered it well. It was the story that launched 1,000 local campfire tales. Interviewer, Detective Miller. Subject, Samuel Kilkenny, 8 years old. It was dark. I heard my mom screaming. The fire was orange, but something else was black. It came through the walls. It was heavy and smelled like a TV when it gets too hot. It ate them. The black fog ate the light. It had hands, but not like yours. It had an extra finger. 6 fingers, the black one had. And then it was gone. Thorne compared the description to the photo on his desk. The same 6 fingers. The same smell of TV when it gets too hot. Ozone/burn electronics. The original legend was not folklore. It was a witness statement. But a detail was missing from the local myth. A detail Thorne had only just witnessed. He looked at the picture again, the 6-fingered stain. Then he looked at the 1983 file. The fire that killed the Kilkennys had burned the house down. Why would the black fog return to this specific location, nearly 40 years later, and only now? Thorne reached for his old, dusty notepad, the one he kept for things he couldn't put in an official report. He scrawled 2 words. 1, 6 fingers. 2, orange glow. The boy, Samuel, had mentioned the fire was orange. Tonight, Thorne saw the faint, orange glow, like an ember in the center of the coalescing black mass. The fire was not a distraction. It was a part of the thing. The escalation. The call came through the dispatch radio again, cutting off the monotonous chatter. This time, the voice of the dispatcher, usually calm, was tight with panic. 413, we have a reported 10 to 54, maybe a 10 to 57, and a possible fatality. The call is from the Blackwood Creek Public Library. The library was the town's cultural landmark, a symbol of safety and knowledge. It was only 3 blocks from the precinct. What's the nature of the emergency? Reyes, now looking marginally better but still pale, grabbed the microphone. "We've lost contact." The caller was the night watchman, Mr. Jenkins. He sounded terrified, said a darkness was moving in the stacks, and he mentioned a smell. Said it smelled like a wet battery cooking. Then the line went dead. We heard a loud shattering sound right before it cut out. Thorne grabbed his jacket. No more discussion. This was the escalation. The black fog was no longer confined to the cursed Kilkenny Farm. It was moving to a new hunting ground. "Reyes, you stay here. Process the Alcott file. I need a clean paper trail." "No, sir. This is the second in 2 hours. You need backup." "And I know the legend," Reyes insisted, her fear overridden by a professional instinct. "If that thing is moving, it's not looking for people. It's looking for something." Thorne hesitated only a moment. Her knowledge of the local myth might be their only real tool. "Fine. Get the shotgun from the trunk. But you follow my lead. No heroics, Reyes. We treat this like a high-risk perimeter breach." The library vault. They arrived at the library. The lights were off, save for a few emergency exit signs casting sickly green pools on the pavement. The front door was untouched. Thorne used his master key. The heavy wooden door creaked open, revealing the cavernous, silent reading room. The smell hit them immediately. A choking mix of ozone, rain, and something acrid, metallic. The metallic tang from the precinct, magnified tenfold. "Perimeter clear," Reyes whispered, her shotgun held low. "But the smell is getting stronger. It's coming from the historical archives, Detective." The historical archives were located in the center of the building, a climate-controlled, windowless room protected by a thick, antique steel vault door. It held the town's most sensitive documents, tax records, old church ledgers, and the original, untouched police reports from before the precinct was built. They followed the stench toward the vault. They found Mr. Jenkins, the night watchman, first. He wasn't dead, but he was huddled against a bookshelf, paralyzed, his eyes wide and staring at the vault door. "What happened, Jenkins?" Thorne asked, his voice low. Jenkins didn't respond, only whimpered, his gaze glued to the door. Reyes pointed. "Look, Detective. The vault." The ancient steel vault door, solid enough to withstand a bomb, had a new, terrifying addition. Scrawled across the matte gray metal, 6 feet up, was another black, oily, 6-fingered handprint. It was even larger than the one at Mrs. Alcott's. And just like before, the substance was still wet, giving off that faint scent of burnt metal. But the shattering sound the dispatcher heard? Thorne found the source. Near the base of the vault door, lying shattered on the marble floor, were fragments of glass and ceramic. Reyes picked up a shard. It was a display case. "Detective, this case used to hold the original 1907 Blackwood Creek town charter." The charter was gone. Stolen. But who would steal a brittle, century-old town charter, and how? Thorne looked from the empty display case to the black handprint on the steel door. He felt a sudden, terrifying realization click into place. The black fog isn't a natural disaster, Reyes. It's not just killing people, Thorne said, adjusting his grip on his flashlight, its beam now fixed on the impenetrable steel of the vault. It's hunting, and it's looking for something historical, something written. He noticed a new detail on the vault door. A faint, glowing orange line had appeared, tracing the outside edge of the 6-fingered handprint. The ember glow was back. Suddenly, the lights in the library flickered violently, not once, but several times, before plunging the entire building into absolute darkness, leaving them alone with the cold, the smell, and the terrifying evidence of the black fog's methodical return. The chilling hunt had officially begun. The sudden darkness was an aggressive, solid thing. Thorne didn't hesitate. He grabbed Reyes's arm and yanked her back toward the main reading room. The ozone smell intensified, momentarily searing his nostrils. "Light. Use your phone, Reyes," he barked. She fumbled, her fingers slick with cold sweat, before the flashlight app flared, casting distorted shadows on the towering stacks of books. Mr. Jenkins, the watchman, had mercifully collapsed unconscious. "It knows we're here, Detective." "It shut the power," Reyes whispered, her eyes wide as she scanned the oppressive shadows. It touched the vault door, Reyes. Whatever it is, it's physical enough to leave residue and strong enough to get through thick steel, or at least trigger a breach alarm that shut down the grid. Thorne countered, though the explanation felt hollow even to him. And it took a 100-year-old piece of paper. Not gold, not cash. A document. They retreated rapidly to the entrance, the silence of the massive library pressing down on them. Once outside, the fresh, cold night air was a relief. Thorne sealed the main door with police tape. Back to the station. We're going dark on this for now. No public statement about the charter being missing. We can't let this thing know we understand what it's doing, Thorne instructed. We need to find out what is so important about the 1907 Blackwood Creek Town Charter. The silent patient. By 6 a.m., the rising sun offered no warmth. Thorne and Reyes were huddled over a photocopy of the 1907 Charter, acquired from a municipal history book. It was a dense, archaic document of land grants, taxation rules, and town boundaries. It's all boilerplate legal nonsense, Detective, Reyes concluded, running a highlighter over the dense script. Except maybe this section, Article 4, Subsection B. It concerns the original land appropriation for the town's first reservoir and the subsequent condemnation of the surrounding 3 square miles, land belonging to the Kilkenny family. Thorne felt a jolt of recognition. The Kilkenny Farm was condemned land, never fully developed due to the tragedy. The fog is tied to the Kilkenny family, and now it's tied to the document that took their land. Thorne mused, tapping the file with his pen. We need to know what Samuel Kilkenny saw beyond the 6 fingers. We need to go back to the source. 2 hours later, Thorne was sitting in a sterile, pale blue visitor's room at the St. Jude's Regional Psychiatric Facility, 2 counties over. Opposite him sat Samuel Kilkenny, now 50 years old. Samuel was a gaunt man, prematurely aged, with a perpetually terrified, faraway look in his eyes. Mr. Kilkenny, I'm Detective Thorne. I'm here about the night of the fire, back in 1983, Thorne began gently. Samuel flinched, pulling his hands into the sleeves of his institutional gown. It remembers the fire. It remembers the heat. I believe you, Samuel. I saw something that suggests what you called the black fog is real. I saw the 6-fingered handprint, Thorne said, using the detail as leverage. Samuel's head snapped up, his eyes suddenly focused and terrified. You saw the sign. Did you see the ember? It keeps the ember. Yes, I saw a glowing orange light inside the blackness, Thorne confirmed, leaning forward. Samuel began to rock slowly, whispering, The charter. The charter is the wick. The paper catches the light. The fog doesn't want the land, Detective. It wants the agreement. What agreement? The town charter. There was a piece of it. A small, burned piece. My father kept it hidden. He said when the town took the land, they didn't realize they took something else, too. Something old. Something that needs to be unwritten. Samuel's voice dropped to a conspiratorial rasp. The fog can't touch it until it finds the record. It consumes the proof. The third strike, the records office. Thorne left St. Jude's with a chilling new objective. The black fog was an intelligence, an entity seeking to erase a historical legal agreement, treating documents as kindling. He called Reyes from the car. Reyes, I need you to find every document connected to the 1907 Charter's land appropriation. Specifically, anything referencing subsoil rights or pre-existing structures in that 3-mile area. And Reyes, where are the current, official municipal records of Blackwood Creek kept? The County Records Annex, Detective, on Elm Street. It's got the digital backups and all the original certified copies of the charter and subsequent amendments. It's supposed to be impenetrable, a concrete bunker, Reyes replied, sounding strained. It has paper. That's enough for the fog. Get the local sheriff's department to put a perimeter around it. Tell them it's a high-level vandalism threat, anything but the truth. I'm almost there. But Thorne was too late. As he drove onto Elm Street, the county records annex was bathed in the red and blue pulse of flashing emergency lights. 2 sheriff's deputies stood outside, staring up at the roof. Thorne slammed the door of his car and ran toward them. What happened? Did anyone enter the building? The sheriff's deputy, a young man named Harris, looked shell-shocked. "No, detective." No one came in. The security guard, Mr. Vance, he was inside. "We just got here." He hit his panic button. "Well, what's the threat?" Harris swallowed hard, pointing a trembling finger at the thick, reinforced glass window on the second floor, which housed the main indexing room. The window had not been broken out or in. It had been melted. A perfectly circular section of the quarter-inch thick glass, about 4 feet in diameter, was slumped inward like hot molasses, hanging by the edges. It was a massive, drooping, translucent lens, and surrounding the melted glass was a thick, black, oily stain, the 6-fingered signature. Inside the building, Thorne could see the main vault door, which held the original documents. The alarm siren was a high-pitched, desperate wail. But the worst part was the air. From the gaping hole in the window, a constant stream of tiny, charred paper fragments, like thick, black confetti, was being violently sucked out into the night air. The air was thick with the smell of scorched earth and burnt sugar. The black fog was already inside. It wasn't just stealing documents, it was incinerating them. It was erasing history with physical, malevolent heat. Thorne stared at the window, the melted glass reflecting the frantic red lights. The fog wasn't a monster that hunted people, but a sentient force of erasure. And he realized something crucial. The town charter was the wick, but the ember he and Samuel saw, the orange glow, was the destructive, consuming fire. He pulled his sidearm, the cold metal feeling useless against a force that melted glass. "Where is Vance, the guard?" Thorne demanded. "His car is still here, detective, but the building is locked from the inside. We haven't heard anything but the siren," Harris stammered. Thorne looked at the melted window. The fog was inside, and it was feeding. "Reyes, I'm going in. Find me the location of the very first copy of the charter, the one before the 1907 official one. I need to know what it said before the land was condemned. That's the original wick. And I need to know what Samuel Kilkenny's father hid." Thorne kicked in the security keypad box, smashing the wires, and forced his way through the main door, stepping into the rising, suffocating smell of burnt paper and ozone. Determined to face the archive hunter before Blackwood Creek's history was literally sucked into the void. The inside of the county records annex was a maelstrom of destruction and confusion. The emergency lighting was mostly functional, but the main power was out, plunging the vast rows of metal shelving into an oppressive, rhythmic gloom. The scent of burnt sugar and ozone was immediate and nauseating. Fine, gritty ash coated everything. Thorne moved with his service weapon drawn, his flashlight beam cutting through the thick, settling soot. He wasn't looking for a perp. He was looking for a sign of the supernatural equivalent of a structural fire, a fire that only burned the paper, not the shelves. He found the security guard, Mr. Vance, in the main indexing room, near the large melted window. Vance was alive, but barely conscious, pressed against a filing cabinet. He was not physically injured, but his face was contorted in a silent scream, his eyes tracking something that wasn't there. "Vance, where's the vault?" Thorne yelled, shaking the guard's shoulder. Vance just mumbled, pointing a weak finger toward the central, thickest wall of the building. It was hot, detective. It wasn't smoke. It was a mouth. And the sound, it was sucking the names away. Thorne checked his pulse. Vance was in shock. He needed to be secured. Leaving the guard for the incoming deputies, Thorne followed the trail of destruction. In the central records room, the reality of the fog's methodical attack was sickening. Hundreds of boxes marked Blackwood Creek municipal documents lay scattered. The paper inside was not scattered, it was gone. In the center of the room, near the massive, heat-resistant vault door, the target was the highest concentration of the black residue. It was a pool of the oily substance, thick and viscous, glistening under the emergency lights. Thorne approached cautiously. The temperature in this spot was unnaturally high, radiating an intense, dry heat, as if the air itself was scorching. This was the source of the ember. He raised his flashlight to the vault door. The black fog had not yet breached the main certified copies of the charter. It was busy consuming the easily accessible copies, amendments, and cross-references. It was clearing the periphery before attacking the core. A sudden, sharp snap of static made Thorn spin around, gun leveled. The black pool was beginning to rise. It stretched, coalescing into the familiar, hulking 7-foot silhouette. This time, there was no sound of sucking. Just a low, furious hiss, like steam escaping a pressure valve. And the ember, the single, burning orange sphere in the fog center, was blindingly bright, pulsating with an internal, contained violence. Thorn fired 2 shots. The bullets hit the mass and vanished with the same wet, thwomp sound as before. The mass didn't flinch. It didn't react. It was impervious. Thorn backed away slowly, yelling, "Blackwood Creek police. Drop whatever you are doing. Put the document down." He felt ridiculous, shouting a legal demand at a sentient shadow. The fog reacted, not to his threat, but to his words. The mass shifted, and one of the 6-fingered appendages extended toward a bookshelf behind Thorn. With impossible speed, the thing seized a large, heavy ledger labeled 1907 to 1909 property deeds. A horrific, high-pitched screech, not from the fog, but from the paper itself, erupted as the fog absorbed the ledger. The black mass began to glow from within, the ember expanding rapidly. The pages dissolved instantly, sucked into the vortex of the fog. The entity was not just erasing history, it was feeding on it, growing stronger with every document it consumed. The revelation of the first wick. Thorn was about to make a tactical retreat when his radio crackled to life. It was Reyes, her voice tight with adrenaline and urgency. "Detective, I found it. I went into the original precinct archives, the pre-1900 box. There was a survey map and a notation by a surveyor named E.C. Thorn, your ancestor, sir, who was mapping the Kilkenny land back in 1899. The information slammed into Thorn like a physical blow. His own family was tied to this. What did the map show, Reyes? It shows a small, unmarked plot of land. A small, square acre right in the center of the Kilkenny Farm property, near the old Kilkenny well. The notation says, land reserved by original agreement, excluded from condemnation of 1907, the well and the covenant. The first charter excluded that piece of land, but the official 1907 version made no mention of it. It was erased, detective. That's the piece Samuel Kilkenny's father hid. The first copy, the original agreement. The black fog turned its attention from the melting ledger, its entire mass seeming to focus on Thorn. The ember inside it pulsed with dangerous recognition. The covenant, the fog hissed, the sound thin and metallic, echoing Mrs. Alcott's earlier whisper. The heat remembers the names of the betrayers. The voice, for the first time, was not just a whisper. It was a compound sound, layered with hundreds of muffled, desperate voices, the sound of every person whose name had been consumed. The covenant is the original wick, Thorn. It's the proof that the land was stolen and the agreement broken. The fog needs to consume the covenant to unwrite the whole betrayal. Reyes cried over the radio. The last stand and the next target. The black fog began to advance, sliding across the floor toward Thorn. The heat emanating from it was so intense, the pages on a nearby desk began to spontaneously combust. Thorn knew he couldn't fight it, and he couldn't outrun it forever. He had to lead it away from the building and toward the truth. Reyes, the covenant. Where would Samuel Kilkenny's father hide a piece of paper that important? Something he called the original agreement. He didn't hide it in a house, detective. He hid it where he knew the fog couldn't touch it. He hid it in a place of new faith. The historical record shows Kilkenny was a devout member of the Blackwood Creek First Church steeple. The steeple was the town's first true fireproof structure, built in 1910, 3 years after the charter was written. Thorn understood. The fog was focused on documents. It was intelligent, methodical, and operating on a historical legal agenda. It would systematically destroy every legal record connected to the land until it found the original. He looked at the towering, oily mass of the fog, which was now only 10 feet away, its 6-fingered hands reaching. You want the covenant? You have to come find me. Thorn growled, shoving a heavy filing cabinet at the entity. It passed through the cabinet, but the distraction bought him a precious second. He turned and ran, scrambling out of the burning archives. He left the security guard for the arriving deputies, who were already pulling up to the scene. Jumping into his car, he grabbed the radio. "Reyes, listen to me. The Black Fog is an unwritten agent. It is going to the Blackwood Creek First Church steeple. It is going after the original covenant to fully erase the Kilkenny land deal. It is our final target. I want every available unit sent there. We are going to make our stand at the steeple. We are going to protect the document and stop the ember from consuming the only proof we have." Thorne slammed the cruiser into drive, tires squealing on the wet asphalt. He was in a race against a dark entity driven by vengeance and paper, speeding toward a church that suddenly felt less like a sanctuary and more like a high-stakes, historical battlefield. The drive to the Blackwood Creek First Church, built on the highest point in the center of town, took Thorne 5 desperate minutes. He bypassed every traffic law, the siren wailing a useless warning against a phantom menace. Reyes, coordinating from the precinct, was screaming updates over the radio. "Detective, local sheriff units are inbound, but they're 15 minutes out. They're still treating this as a severe vandalism and arson threat. They won't go in without a confirmed fire. Tell them the fire is here, Reyes. It's just waiting for the wick." Thorne snarled into the mic. The First Church was a magnificent, century-old structure of dark field stone, its Gothic architecture dominating the town square. The steeple was its crown, a towering spire of thick granite and wood, intended to hold the heavy brass bell. It looked immutable. Thorne pulled his cruiser directly onto the church lawn and killed the engine. The surrounding area was silent, peaceful, and bitterly cold. No fire, no black residue, no ozone smell. Yet, he ran to the heavy oak front doors. They were locked. He kicked the security box and used a heavy boot to splinter the lock assembly. He burst into the nave, the main hall of the church. It was dark, illuminated only by the faint light filtering through the stained glass windows. The air inside smelled of dust, beeswax, and old wood polish, the scent of sanctuary. He moved quickly to the side aisle, searching for access to the steeple. He found a small, narrow door leading to a winding stone staircase. Above it, a sign read, "Belfry Access, Authorized Personnel Only." Just as Thorne put his hand on the brass knob, he heard it. The familiar, terrifying sound. A loud, distant hiss that vibrated through the stone floor, followed by the sound of something immense and abrasive scraping against granite. The black fog had arrived. The steeple breach. Thorne looked out the nearest window. The fog was not entering through the front door. It was scaling the outside of the steeple itself. He could see the outline of the 7-foot mass, moving with impossible speed and dexterity, climbing the sheer stone face like a dark, oily liquid poured upward. Each time its 6-fingered appendages grabbed a purchase, the granite steamed and left a faint, black smear. The heat being generated was so intense, the rain hitting the stone nearby evaporated instantly. The ember was brighter than ever, a raging orange inferno contained within the pitch-black mass, focused entirely on the height of the steeple. Thorne raced up the narrow, claustrophobic stone steps, his heavy boots echoing. The climb was endless, spiral after spiral. As he ascended, the temperature plummeted, forcing the cold air from the lower levels to rush past him. The fog was heating the structure from the outside, creating an internal vacuum of cold. He reached the top level, the belfry, a small, square room dominated by the massive, motionless brass bell. The room was mostly wooden beams and rafters, making it a critical vulnerability. Looking up, Thorne saw the trapdoor leading into the small attic space at the very peak of the spire. It was there. It had to be. He found a hidden compartment beneath a loose floorboard, a small, square recess, dusty and long forgotten. Inside lay a brittle, rolled-up parchment tied with a thin, faded ribbon. The covenant. The unwritten word. Thorne unrolled the document quickly, holding his flashlight on the faded ink. It wasn't the charter itself, but a single-page agreement, handwritten and signed in 1899 by the Kilkenny Patriarch and the town's first mayor. It stated, in eloquent, flowery script, that in exchange for the use of the Kilkenny land for the reservoir, the town would forever maintain a specific, small, spring-fed well on the property, the Well of the Covenant, and that the Kilkenny family would receive a perpetual annual payment. But the final line was what made Thorne's blood run cold. Should this covenant be broken or willfully ignored, the Kilkenny land shall be returned to the earth, and the ember of the original fire shall be released to cleanse the record. This wasn't just a legal document. It was a binding, curse-like promise. The black fog was the ember, a historical, sentient force released to cleanse the record because the town had long since forgotten and failed to maintain the well, which was likely paved over during the 1907 condemnation. Crack! The massive, ancient brass bell above Thorne suddenly shuddered violently. A shower of dust and stone flakes rained down as the outside pressure intensified. The fog had reached the belfry level. Thorne looked up at the main wooden beam supporting the bell. A black, oily substance was now seeping through the gaps where the stone met the wood, smelling of burnt electricity. The heat outside was unimaginable. He had to protect the paper, but Reyes's words echoed in his mind. He hid it where he knew the fog couldn't touch it. He looked around the belfry. Stone and wood. The fog melted glass and consumed paper. It was defeated only by the thick, cold steel of the unbreached vault. The revelation of cold. Thorne looked at the covenant in his hand, then at the massive, inert brass bell. He had an insane, desperate thought. He grabbed the nearest heavy wooden plank and began hammering at the bell's support mechanism. He had to get the bell to swing. The fog completely breached the outer wall. A huge section of the stone facade nearest the bell melted inward, exposing the massive, coiling black mass that filled the hole. It advanced into the belfry, its ember a fierce, blinding orange. It didn't scream or roar. It hissed, and the sound was the compound whisper of all the consumed voices. It stretched its six-fingered hand toward the covenant in Thorne's hand. "It ends now," Thorne yelled, his voice rough. He slammed the wooden plank against the bell support one final time. The massive, multi-ton bell broke loose from its central pin and swung violently, silently, through the small room. The black fog, which had no form to be hit, did not move. It was immune to physical force. But the sheer volume and density of the ancient brass bell, which had been resting in the perpetual shade of the steeple, was a repository of extreme cold. As the heavy brass mass swung past, the black fog, an entity of destructive heat and consumption, was momentarily enveloped by a wave of intense, dry cold radiating from the metal. The fog shrieked, a genuine, non-electronic sound of agony. Its cohesive form instantly dissipated, collapsing from a 7-foot entity into a thin, harmless pool of black, oily vapor. The ember inside it shrunk down to a pinprick, sputtering feebly. The sucking sound stopped. The intense heat vanished. The belfry was suddenly just a cold, dusty room again. Thorne realized the terrifying truth, the entity's weakness. The black fog, the ember, was an entity of heat, consumption, and erasing fire. Its only vulnerability was absolute cold and the physical density of non-combustible mass. He had bought time. The fog was temporarily stunned. He grabbed the brass bell's thick rope, holding the covenant in his teeth. He knew he couldn't leave the document there, and he couldn't take it back to a flimsy police precinct. He now had the key. Cold stops the fog. He looked at the paralyzed, shrinking pool of black residue. It would reform, and soon. "Reyes, listen carefully. I know how to hold it." Thorne shouted into the radio, his voice strained. "It can't survive extreme, sudden cold. Get the hazmat team to mobilize every liquid nitrogen canister and high-capacity industrial freezer in the county. We are moving the covenant to the only place cold enough to protect it, the Blackwood Creek meat packing plant cold storage. I'll meet you there. We are going to lock this thing in ice." Thorne secured the covenant in his shirt pocket and began the long, hurried descent, the heavy brass bell slowly swinging above him, acting as a temporary, silent sentinel of cold. The battle was not won, but the weapon had been found. Thorn didn't wait for the black fog to recoalesce. He scrambled down the stone spiral staircase, the sound of his boots now muffled by the adrenaline pounding in his ears. He burst out of the church, ignoring the two uniformed deputies who had just arrived, sirens blazing. "Get out of the car and secure this building. The threat is contained by extreme cold, but it's still in there. Do not go near the steeple." Thorn barked, already peeling out of the churchyard. He didn't bother looking in his rearview mirror. He could feel the entity's presence, the cold fear radiating from the direction of the church. The fog had been momentarily stunned, but it was intelligent. It knew its target was moving. Reyes met him halfway to the industrial zone, driving the unmarked car. She jumped out, her face pale but determined. "I diverted all units and resources to the packing plant. The sheriff thinks I've lost it, but they're moving a hazmat team and 2 industrial freezers, just in case. The plant manager is cooperating. He's clearing out the main freezer unit for us. It runs at -40 degrees Fahrenheit," Reyes explained, quickly taking the wheel of Thorn's car. "Good. That's where the Covenant is going," Thorn confirmed, clutching his pocket. "And Reyes, the fog's weakness isn't mass, it's cold. But the fire, the ember, that's its power. It can melt glass. It can consume paper. It's an erasing agent driven by a broken promise." The cold storage setup. The Blackwood Creek meat packing plant was a massive, single-story industrial fortress of corrugated metal and refrigeration units. The air around the loading docks was already sharp with the scent of ozone and chilled brine. They met the plant manager, Mr. Davies, a nervous man in a white apron, at the main cold storage door, a thick, metal hatch resembling a bank vault. "The main locker, Detective. It's set at -40. It's empty. Nothing alive can last in there for more than 20 minutes, Davies said, handing Thorn a massive key. "Perfect," Thorn muttered. He looked at the room. Stainless steel walls, ceiling, and floor. No paper, no wood, nothing to absorb or combust. Reyes and Thorn worked fast. They secured the Covenant inside a small, sealed steel lockbox. They placed the lockbox deep inside the main cold storage unit. "It's safe for now, but we can't stay here," Thorn said, stepping back out, the vapor from his breath freezing instantly in the air. "We have to. This is the only place in Blackwood Creek cold enough to stall it," Reyes countered, pulling her jacket tight. "No, we need to set a trap. It will burn its way through anything to get to that room. We can't fight fire with cold. We fight fire with confusion." Thorn then instructed Reyes to do something counterintuitive. Mobilize every fire hose and sprinkler system in the industrial park and aim them toward the cold storage walls. "We flood the area? What? The fog is fire and consumption. We hit it with a high-pressure, dense blast of water and cold. If we can slow it down, we might be able to contain it long enough for the hazmat teams to seal it in a specialized unit." The retaliation, blinding heat. The warning came not as a sound, but as an absence. The hum of the plant's massive refrigeration units, a constant low vibration that filled the air, suddenly died. The power hadn't been cut. The machines had been silenced. "It's here," Thorn said, grabbing his weapon. "It's attacking the infrastructure. The ember is heating the coolant lines." He looked toward the main entrance. A massive, gaping hole appeared in the corrugated metal wall, as if a gigantic, 6-fingered hand had pressed against it and melted the steel. The stench of burned metal and ozone was immediate and overwhelming. The black fog entered the loading dock. It was bigger now, more defined, its silhouette thicker, and the orange ember at its center pulsed with contained rage. It had consumed enough records to gain a terrifying new capability. It didn't slide across the floor this time. It levitated several inches above the ground, moving with deliberate, horrifying speed toward the main cold storage door. Thorn gave the order. "Reyes, hit it." Now, Reyes activated the main sprinkler and fire hose system. A massive torrent of high-pressure water blasted the black fog. The water didn't put it out. It hit the entity and instantly vaporized into a cloud of scalding, superheated steam, which expanded violently and filled the dock. The steam was so hot, it felt like the air was tearing the skin from their faces. It's not just fire, detective. It's consuming the temperature differential. Reyes screamed, shielding her face. The black fog emerged from the cloud of steam, unaffected, its ember throbbing triumphantly. The use of water had only created a thermal shield for the entity. It slammed its six-fingered appendage against the huge steel door of the cold storage unit. Instead of melting the metal, the fog did something worse. It etched the entire six-fingered outline onto the steel. The sound was a high-pitched, metallic scream. The steel itself began to glow cherry red around the outline of the handprint. The heat was being focused so intensely on the door's weak points, the hinges and the lock, that they were starting to warp. The voice in the cold. Thorne saw the inevitable breach coming. They couldn't stop it with water or even its own weakness. The fog was adapting too fast. He fired his weapon, aiming not at the fog, but at the main electrical panel controlling the plant's auxiliary power. The panel sparked, and the emergency lights flickered on, but the cold storage unit remained dark. Suddenly, the voice returned. Not the collective whisper, but a single, clear, rasping voice, coming from the depths of the fog's mass. Your bloodline, Thorne. Your great-grandfather sealed the lie. He buried the well. He hid the covenant that condemns this land to the heat. The fog now spoke with specific historical malice. It knew Elias Thorne's connection to the crime. Thorne felt a new wave of panic. He was not just a detective protecting a document. He was the descendant of the betrayer. The steel door was shrieking as the hinges buckled, glowing a dull orange. The fog was moments from breaching the sanctuary. Reyes pointed a terrified finger down the long, empty loading dock. Detective, look. The hazmat teams are here. They have the liquid nitrogen tanks. If we can get it to focus on them. Thorne looked at the breach. The door wouldn't last another 30 seconds. He knew what he had to do. He had to be the distraction. Reyes, call the hazmat commander. Tell him to wait until I give the signal. I have to go inside. The cold storage is the only place it can't fully burn, but it might be the only place where I can make it overextend its ember. Thorne pulled the heavy key from the lock, grabbed a handheld flare from a nearby emergency kit, and rushed toward the door, which was about to give way, preparing to lure the sentient, historical furnace into the one place where its power would be its undoing. Thorne didn't hesitate. As the cold storage door began to groan and buckle inward from the intense, focused heat, he jammed the heavy key into the lock and turned it, throwing the door open. He was met with a rush of dense, stinging, -40-degree air that instantly coated his exposed skin in a layer of frost. He stepped inside the vast, cavernous stainless steel chamber. He was immediately enveloped by a darkness far deeper than the exterior gloom, lit only by the faint, icy light reflecting off the steel walls. He pulled the flare from his jacket pocket and twisted the cap. The chemical ignition sputtered, then flared, casting a desperate, sputtering red light that barely penetrated the dense atmosphere. He stood near the center of the unit, next to the small steel lockbox containing the covenant. Come on, ancestor. Finish what you started, Thorne whispered, pulling the covenant, the brittle, rolled-up parchment, out of the lockbox and holding it up against the flare's weak glow. Outside, the steel door shrieked one last time, tearing from its hinges. It collapsed inward with a deafening crash, sending a blizzard of cold air and condensation billowing into the loading dock. The black fog entered the cold storage. Overextension. The moment the black fog crossed the threshold, it was met with overwhelming resistance. The -40-degree air didn't stop it, but it immediately began to wage war on the entity's core nature. The fog's shape was unstable, shivering violently. To maintain its form and the corrosive heat needed to breach the cold, the orange ember at its center had to drastically increase its output. It swelled into a pulsating, blinding sphere, forcing the fog to dedicate almost all its consumed energy just to exist. The fog hissed, its compound whisper now strained and distorted, like hundreds of voices drowning in a frozen lake. The wick, it must be unwritten, the heat remembers. It knew Thorne was bait, but the raw, historical importance of the covenant. The final, most crucial record of the betrayal made the entity utterly predictable. It ignored Thorne's firearm and lunged, its six-fingered hand reaching for the paper. "Here's the deal, Ember," Thorne yelled, the sound flat in the cold air. "You want the paper, you have to burn it. And you can't burn it without overheating." Thorne raised the Covenant closer to the fog. The intense heat emanating from the ember was staggering. The brittle parchment began to smoke, turning brown at the edges. The fog had focused its entire destructive power, its ember, into a singular, scorching point aimed at the document. It was fully committed. "Now, Reyes. Now," Thorne screamed into his radio, tossing the document away from the fog and onto the cold, steel floor. The containment. Outside, Officer Reyes, standing with the hazmat commander, slammed the transmit button. "Go." Hit the door frame. For hazmat technicians, bundled in reflective insulated suits, deployed high-pressure hoses connected to massive liquid nitrogen tanks. They didn't aim at the fog directly. They aimed at the door frame and the entire collapsed entryway. The liquefied nitrogen, at -320 degrees Fahrenheit, hit the superheated, collapsed steel frame and the thick, oily residue left by the fog. The effect was instantaneous and violent. The area surrounding the entrance froze solid. The fog, its ember fully extended and focused, was suddenly hit by the rapidly dropping ambient temperature of the environment combined with the flash freezing of its entry point. The entity let out a soundless, terrifying wave of pure, negative energy. The ember violently imploded, shrinking from a blinding sphere back to a tiny, sputtering pinprick. The black mass convulsed, its oily texture transforming into something brittle and glassy. With a loud, metallic crack, the black fog shattered, collapsing onto the stainless steel floor not as liquid or vapor, but as a mound of jagged, obsidian-like shards, instantly freezing to the sub-zero floor. The shards were utterly cold, inert, and immobile. The ember was extinguished. Thorne rushed to the Covenant, which was smoking but intact, the cold steel floor having immediately quenched the ember's attempted burn. Reyes and the hazmat commander rushed into the chamber, their breathing heavy. "It's contained, Detective." Flash frozen to the floor. The commander stated, his voice muffled by his respirator. "We need to detach the pieces and transfer it into a dedicated cold containment unit, a sub-zero vault." The aftermath and the lingering trace. Thorne stepped out of the cold storage, leaving the team to manage the frigid debris. The adrenaline crash hit him hard. He was physically shaking, not just from the cold, but from the raw, existential horror he had just faced. Back in the loading dock, warmed by heaters, Reyes looked at him with a mixture of awe and concern. "We did it, Detective. The Covenant is safe. The fog is in pieces," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "Blackwood Creek is safe. For now," Thorne corrected, rubbing his chest where the intense heat had burned his jacket fabric. "It's a sentient historical agreement made manifest. It won't stay frozen forever, Reyes. It's waiting for the heat to return." The hazmat commander approached them, holding a small, insulated container. "Detective, we secured the largest piece. It's hard as granite, but totally inert. It's not physical matter, though. The density is too high. Keep it cold," Thorne ordered. "It's evidence in a murder case." Thorne retrieved the Covenant. The parchment, though singed at the edges, was intact. He needed to analyze it further, find out why his ancestor was involved, and more importantly, how to permanently dissolve the curse. As they prepared to leave, Reyes pointed to the cold storage door, the one that had been melted and torn off its hinges. The surface was still marked by the massive, etched six-fingered handprint from the fog's attack. "Detective, look at this. The steel is cooling now," Reyes said, tracing the pattern. Thorne looked at the imprint. The steel was back to its dull gray. The black residue was gone, but the etching remained. And in the center of the six-fingered impression, now cold and metallic, was a single, perfect orange fingerprint, the exact size and shape of Thorne's own index finger. It was impossibly hot to the touch, and it did not cool. It was not a residue, but a mark branded deep into the metal. "It's personal, Reyes. It told me my bloodline betrayed it, Thorne said, staring at the brand. He realized the terrifying implication. The fog had not just left a mark. By containing the ember, the force of consumption had transferred a small, burning fragment of its core energy, the heat of the lie, to the detective who was trying to stop it. The six-fingered monster was frozen, but a tiny, burning piece of its ember, a constant, scorching reminder, was now inexplicably linked to Elias Thorne. And the detective had a feeling the heat wasn't going to stay confined to the door for long. The official report filed in the morning was a carefully constructed lie. A catastrophic failure of an industrial coolant system at the meatpacking plant, leading to a thermal explosion and subsequent flash freezing due to excessive liquid nitrogen deployment. The missing persons, Mrs. Alcott and the watchman, Mr. Jenkins, who was still catatonic, were listed as separate, unsolved disappearances, unconnected to the accident. Detective Thorne sat at his desk in Precinct 413, the stale air thick with the usual smells, but he only registered one, a faint, dry, metallic heat that seemed to follow him. The Covenant, secured in a custom-built, perpetually sub-zero vault in a deep storage facility 2 states away, was finally safe. But Thorne was not. He felt the strange heat constantly, focused primarily on his right hand, the hand he'd used to push the Covenant toward the fog, the hand that had rested against the branded steel door. He repeatedly washed his hand, but the skin felt unnaturally dry, almost papery, and warm to the touch, even though the room was cold. "Sir, the hazmat team is requesting official documentation on the black obsidian residue," Reyes said, sliding a folder across his desk. She looked exhausted, but the skepticism was gone, replaced by a grave belief. "Tell them it's a high-density, polymerized oil deposit, possibly a foreign contaminant. Do not let anyone run a thermal scan on the containment unit," Thorne instructed, his voice low and raspy. He knew the ember fragment, even flash-frozen, was still radiating a dangerous, negative heat. As he spoke, he felt a sharp, sudden sting in his right index finger. He looked down. A small, perfect circle on his skin, the size of a fingerprint, had turned a faint, dull orange, like a hot ember under ash. The whisper of the lineage. Thorne knew he was becoming compromised. He had to understand the fog's final words. Your great-grandfather sealed the lie. He spent the next 24 hours deep in the digital archives of Blackwood Creek University, cross-referencing names from the 1899 Covenant. His ancestor, E.C. Thorne, was not a detective, but a prominent civil engineer and surveyor. E.C. Thorne was responsible for the original land survey that led to the 1907 charter and the condemnation of the Kilkenny land. Thorne pulled up E.C. Thorne's personal papers, digitized from a small local museum. Most were standard engineering notes, but tucked inside a leather-bound journal was a series of frantic, handwritten entries dated 1905, 2 years before the official charter was finalized. Entry: May 12, 1905. The well is not what they say. It is not water. It is a cold, dense energy. The Kilkenny family believes it is a sacred spring, a covenant with the earth itself. If we pave over the well and build the reservoir, the energy will be sealed, not destroyed. It will boil over. The town council insists on the reservoir. They insist I adjust the survey to exclude the covenant's original protection. Entry: October 3rd, 1905. I cannot sleep. The heat is constant. I adjusted the lines. I sealed the lie. I excluded the protection clause. The condemnation will proceed. I have taken the money, and the silence is bought. But the Kilkenny boy saw me. He saw me put the stone over the well. He spoke of the black dust that rose when the light touched the water. The betrayal was clear. E.C. Thorne, for money, deliberately altered the survey to omit the well of the covenant from the protected list, allowing the land to be seized and the source of the cold, dense energy to be buried under the reservoir. The black fog was the entity of heat and consumption, the boiling over of that sealed, cold energy, the original fire that cleansed the record of the lie. The fog hadn't just appeared in 1983, it was active in 1905, watching the betrayal. The scorch mark. Thorne returned to the precinct. The digital archive closed. The truth now a lead weight in his gut. He was the product of a lineage that had created the black fog. He walked past Reyes's desk. She was holding a large, blown-up photo of the melted steel door from the meat packing plant, focusing on the single, glowing orange fingerprint. I ran the residual heat signature on this image, Detective. Using the thermal overlay, I compared it to the six-fingered imprint from the library. The ember is identical. But this single fingerprint, it's the hottest point, Reyes said, pointing. I cross-referenced the coordinates of the fingerprint on the door with the city planning maps. And, Thorne urged, his own right index finger throbbing with a sharp, localized heat. That single, orange, scorching fingerprint on the door, it maps precisely to the location of the original Kilkenny Well of the Covenant, the spot EC. Thorne buried, Reyes revealed, her voice hushed. The ember is telling us where it originated. It's showing us the sealed heart of the curse. Thorne stared at the image. The fog was contained, but its energy signature was now fixed on its physical origin point, the buried well. It didn't just leave a mark, Reyes. It's pointing us to the epicenter. The black fog is trying to force us to unseal the source of the curse. The next move. Thorne placed his hand flat on the desk. He felt the orange burn on his finger, and in the distance, he could swear he heard a sound. The faint, bubbling hiss of something trying to break free. The fog is flash frozen, but its objective, to unwrite the lie, is now our problem. If we don't unseal that well, the pressure from the contained ember will eventually shatter the liquid nitrogen vault, Thorne determined. We have to go to the source. But Detective, the reservoir is still active. The well is buried deep under concrete and water, Reyes countered, worried. We have the covenant. We have the truth. And now we have the map, Thorne said, pulling out the copy of EC. Thorne's survey showing the precise location of the well on the Kilkenny land, which was now part of the reservoir property. I'm mobilizing a small, specialized unit. We're going to the reservoir. We're going to locate the well of the covenant, and we are going to expose the lie that started all of this. If the fog wants the truth unsealed, we'll give it to them. As Thorne stood up, the heat in his fingers suddenly intensified, so sharp it made his vision blur. He clenched his fist, containing the pain. He knew the ember fragment was not just a brand. It was a permanent, internal tether to the black fog. He was no longer just the detective on the case. He was now a living, burning compass, guided by the ancestral lie, leading the way back to the sealed heart of the curse. The final confrontation would not be with the frozen monster, but with the very ground beneath Blackwood Creek. Detective Thorne moved with the weary precision of a man running on borrowed time. The scorching orange brand on his index finger was now a constant, low-level agony, sometimes flaring with intense heat that smelled faintly of burning rubber, a tether to the frozen black fog. He mobilized a small, four-person unit. Himself, Reyes, and two trusted, battle-hardened sheriff's deputies, Miller and Vance, not the catatonic guard, but his cousin, a quiet man who specialized in structural work. Their cover story was a secret structural survey of the reservoir floor using outdated maps. They wore simple utility gear and carried heavy-duty core sampling equipment. The objective was straightforward: locate the exact coordinates of the well of the covenant using EC, Thorne's 1899 survey, drill through the decades of concrete and earth, and expose the well's original seal. We are not here to dig up water, gentlemen, Thorne explained to the team as they loaded the gear onto a specialized flat-bottom boat at 3 a.m. We are here to unseal a lie. Be ready for anything that is not water. Locating the center. The Blackwood Creek Reservoir was a vast, silent expanse of black water, reflecting the cold, starless sky. The air over the water was heavy and still, pressing down on them. According to the 1907 records, the reservoir was nearly 70 feet deep at the center. Using the precise coordinates from the ancestor's survey, they anchored the boat over the identified spot. The GPS confirmed they were hovering directly above the small, single acre that E.C. Thorne had promised to protect and then buried. As they began assembling the hydraulic core drill, the water around the boat began to behave strangely. It didn't ripple, it seemed to shudder, vibrating with a low, subaudible frequency that hurt the eardrums. Thorne's index finger flared violently, the pain forcing a low, choked gasp from him. The orange brand felt like a nail being driven through the bone. The cold is fighting the heat. 100 whispers screeched inside Thorne's mind, layered over the agonizing sound of the contained fog demanding release. The fog is reacting. It knows we're here, Thorne rasped, clutching his hand. Reyes, get the drill started. We have to breach the seal fast. Breaching the seal. The heavy-duty drill bit began to grind into the reservoir floor, the sound harsh and grating. They drilled through meters of silt, clay, and the final layer of century-old, specially poured concrete laid by E.C. Thorne himself. The water pressure, normally stable, began to fluctuate wildly, and the surface of the reservoir was now covered in strange, localized swirls, small, counterclockwise eddies that seemed to have their own internal energy. Suddenly, the drill hit something dense and hard, not stone, but metal. I think we hit the original seal, Detective, Vance reported, checking the gauges. It's a thick iron plate. It feels magnetically sealed. Full power, Vance. Break through it, Thorne ordered. As the drill hammered the metal, Thorne's ember fragment flared into agonizing life. He collapsed onto the deck of the boat, gasping for air. The entire frozen black fog seemed to be screaming through his finger, a chaotic demand for the cold to be unsealed. The betrayal is complete. The cold must burn. Reyes knelt beside him, worry etched deep into her face. Detective, you're burning up. Your temperature is spiking. Thorne forced himself up. The ember is trying to stop us. It's trying to keep the cold sealed. Keep drilling. With a final, terrible screech of grinding metal, the drill bit broke through the iron plate. The resistance was gone. Vance immediately retracted the drill bit. The fountain of the void. The water above the drilled hole didn't bubble or foam. Instead, a column of water, unnaturally black and still, shot straight up from the hole, forming a perfectly cylindrical tower about 5 feet high above the reservoir surface. It looked like a fountain made of pure, negative space. The temperature around the column instantly dropped, condensing the air into a shimmering fog that did not smell of ozone, but of damp, ancient soil and deep, mineral cold. This was the well of the Covenant, the source of the cold, dense energy E.C. Thorne had buried. As the black column of water reached its peak height, it suddenly stopped and stabilized. Then, the black water at the top of the column began to coagulate, not into steam or ice, but into a shape. It was a translucent, icy blue entity, a being of liquid, super-cold water. It had no sharp edges, shimmering with a diffuse, gentle light, like a nebula trapped in water. It was tall and spindly, but utterly silent and serene. It was the antithesis of the black fog. It was the Covenant entity, the cold, protective force of the Kilkenny land. The entity raised a hand, a graceful, 5-fingered, shimmering appendage, and pointed it directly at Thorne. Thorne's ember fragment flared its brightest yet, searing his finger. The fog, even contained, was raging against this rival force. The cold entity spoke, but not through sound. The words resonated directly in Thorne's mind, clear, melodic, and devastatingly cold. The ancestor's heat is within you. The cold recognizes the betrayal. You have released the protector, but the original wound remains. The Covenant entity wasn't a monster, it was a judge. It was protecting the land, but it saw Thorne as the living legacy of the crime. What is the wound? Thorne gasped, his voice tight with pain. The Covenant demands the truth. Not just the paper, but the final payment. The payment was not money, Detective Thorne. It was the name. The icy entity pointed its shimmering hand back toward the Kilkenny Farm, then at Thorne's burning finger. The direction was clear. The solution to the curse was a specific name or person, and the final payment had to be made there. Thorn knew the black fog was an erasing fire, and the covenant entity was the protective cold. But the final act required a sacrifice related to the original lie, a human price that transcended documents. He looked at the peaceful, terrifying blue entity, then at the burning orange brand on his finger, the two opposing forces of the curse. Reyes, we're done here. Secure the drill. We know the name, or we know where to find it. The well is open. The fog's containment won't last much longer. We have to go back to the beginning. We're going to the Kilkenny Farm for the final payment. The drive back to Kilkenny Farm was agonizingly silent, punctuated only by the low hiss of the engine and Thorn's suppressed groans. The ember fragment on his index finger was now a glowing, angry scar, radiating a feverish heat that his whole body struggled to absorb. He was sweating profusely despite the cold night air rushing through the open window. The covenant entity called it the final payment, a name, Reyes murmured, looking down at the ancient, singed parchment of the covenant, now lying flat on the dashboard under the dome light. We know the ancestors are involved. E.C. Thorn, Kilkenny Patriarch. But who is the name? Thorn clenched his jaw, fighting the psychic screaming of the contained black fog. The link through his finger was becoming unbearable. The frozen entity was sensing its rival, the covenant entity, and its containment was failing. It's not the betrayer, Reyes. It's the witness. The one the fog wanted to consume first. Thorn choked out, his throat dry. Go back to the 1983 file. The survivor. The one who saw the 6 fingers and the black fog. Reyes grabbed the copy of the old police report, flipping through the brittle pages. Samuel Kilkenny, 8 years old. He's the one still locked up at St. Jude's, she read aloud. The fog is the force of erasure. It consumed the mother, father, and the twins. Why didn't it take Samuel? Thorn rasped, his eyes burning. Because the containment of the fog, the burial of the well, was already complete. Samuel was the last loose end, the final witness who named the black fog. He's the physical, living memory of the betrayal. Reyes's eyes widened in horror. The final payment isn't a sacrifice to appease it. It's the last piece of proof the fog needs to unwrite. It wants to consume Samuel Kilkenny's memory to complete the eradication of the covenant's truth. The catastrophic signal. Just as the desolate landscape of the Kilkenny Farm came into view, the radio in the cruiser exploded with static. It wasn't local interference. It was a physical, violent burst of white noise. A frantic voice, the hazmat commander, cut through the chaos. Detective Thorn, the containment vault at the facility is compromised. Thermal readings are spiking off the charts. The pressure, it's turning the liquid nitrogen into a superheated gas. The black fog is boiling out. It's reforming. We need immediate evacuation orders. The black fog had fully mobilized its ember, converting the extreme cold into extreme heat. The containment was shattered. It's loose, and it knows where we are, Thorn stated, his voice flat with terrible certainty. The ember fragment on his finger flared so brightly it cast an orange shadow on the car dashboard. We have minutes, maybe less, before it gets here, Reyes said, speeding the cruiser onto the cracked, overgrown driveway of the Kilkenny Farm. They abandoned the car and ran toward the main, partially burned farmhouse, the house where the tragedy began and where Mrs. Alcott vanished. Setting the final trap. The farmhouse was a skeletal ruin, dominated by blackened wood and a pervasive, lingering smell of ash. Thorn and Reyes rushed inside, moving through the echoing silence. We can't let it get to Samuel, but we can't take him out of St. Jude's without exposing him, Reyes said desperately. We don't have to. The fog doesn't consume flesh, Reyes. It consumes proof. The final proof it needs is the name of the witness, the story of the betrayal, and the memory of the 6 fingers. It needs to consume the last living link to the lie. Thorn explained, the revelation chilling him far more than the cold entity. He pulled out the covenant. This document is the original lie. It's the wick. The fog will come for this first, hoping to burn it and make the covenant entity irrelevant. Thorn then pulled out E.C. Thorn's journal, open to the page where he confessed to sealing the well. This is the confession. The fuel. He found the old, heavy, wooden kitchen table where the Kilkenny family likely sat for their final meal. Thorn placed the covenant and the journal on the center of the table. Reyes grabbed a can of kerosene that was left in the corner from the property's last maintenance attempt. We burn the bait. When it focuses the ember to consume this, it won't work. It consumes fire, Reyes. It uses the heat. We need to lure it and then attack its source, Thorn corrected. He looked at the black ember mark on his finger, then at the table. He had to use the one thing the fog could not resist and the one thing that could harm it. The covenant entity is active. The well is unsealed. The cold is fighting the heat, Thorn said, looking toward the old well area outside. The fog will be at its most vulnerable when it is focused on consuming the final, ultimate lie. The final payment. Thorn took the covenant parchment and the ancestral journal. He didn't place them on the table. Instead, he jammed them both into the throat of the ancient stone fireplace, where the original fire that consumed the Kilkennys began. It wants the truth burned at the source of the fire. That's where it will focus its entire being, Thorn determined. He then pulled out his service pistol and, with precise violence, shot the heavy brass bell that Mrs. Alcott had used as a doorstop, knocking it into the center of the living room floor. He had brought it back from the church, thinking it might serve as a decoy. The fog is fire. The covenant entity is cold. The brass bell is dense mass and contained cold, Thorn said. When the fog comes for the papers in the fireplace, we distract it with the cold. The metallic smell of ozone and intense heat began to permeate the farmhouse. The black fog was outside, coiling around the building. The voice was no longer a whisper. It was a deep, resonating roar of collective suffering and rage. Thorn, the wick will be ash. The name will be unwritten. The lie will be consumed. The front door, already damaged, was vaporized in a single burst of blinding orange light. The black fog, reformed, immense, and furiously hot, poured into the farmhouse, its six-fingered appendages trailing black residue on the floor. It ignored Thorn, ignoring the brass bell. Its entire focus was on the covenant, and the journal jammed into the fireplace. The ember at its core swelled to the size of a man's head, pulsating with absolute, consuming malice. As the fog rushed toward the fireplace, Thorn knew this was it. He had lured the pure force of erasure to the exact point of its creation, and he had to make the final, terrible payment. Reyes, the bell. Now, Thorn screamed, as the immense heat from the fog's ember began to scorch his face. Reyes reacted instantly to Thorn's scream. She grabbed the heavy brass bell, the silent sentinel from the church, and with a desperate surge of adrenaline, shoved it with all her strength. The multi-ton bell was too heavy to swing, but Reyes managed to push it, causing it to scrape violently across the wooden floor, colliding with the massive, stable mass of the black fog. The fog, fully committed to consuming the covenant and the journal in the fireplace, had concentrated its entire physical manifestation around the ember. The heavy, cold density of the brass bell slammed into the black, oily matter. The result was not dispersal, but a catastrophic thermal shock. The fog shrieked, a sound that broke the last of the farmhouse windows, and violently fragmented into 1,000 shards of brittle, crackling black matter, instantly cooling from the high-temperature friction with the cold brass. The ember at the center, however, did not shatter. It recoiled, shrinking rapidly but retaining its blazing orange heat, now hovering exactly where the fog had stood, a core of pure, concentrated, malignant fire energy, temporarily detached from the protective black shell. The fog's shrapnel hit Thorn, peppering his face and hands with cold, obsidian-like debris. He barely registered the pain, his eyes fixed on the free-floating ember. The shell is gone, but the ember is free. Thorn roared over the ringing echo of the bell. It's pure heat. It'll incinerate the documents before we can reach them. The ember, recognizing its momentary weakness, shot toward the fireplace with blinding speed, intending to complete its final task, consuming the covenant. The true payment. Thorn didn't move. He knew the ember, now an unstable sphere of pure fire, could not be stopped by physical force. It had to be stopped by the truth it sought to erase, using the one thing now tied to it, his own bloodline's mark. The ember fragment on his index finger was scorching, screaming with the final, unbearable push of the entity's power. Thorn felt the ancestral lie, the pressure of E.C. Thorn's betrayal, like a physical weight inside him. The ember reached the fireplace. The covenant and the journal, jammed into the soot-stained throat, began to burst into flame. The papers were curling, turning brown, the ink vaporizing. "It's not just the paper," Thorn yelled, his voice raw. "It's the unwriting. The payment is not just the name, Reyes. It's the final, physical undoing of the ancestor's handiwork." Thorn launched himself forward, ignoring Reyes's frantic cry. He thrust his right arm, the one bearing the burning orange brand, into the raging heat of the ember and the consuming flames of the covenant. He didn't grab the paper. He didn't try to put out the fire. He used his branded index finger to trace the outline of the single, crucial line in E.C. Thorn's journal that defined the betrayal. I adjusted the lines. With the searing hot mark of the ember fragment on his own hand, Thorn physically traced the words, "I adjusted the lines," on the burning page, unwriting the lie with the fire it had manifested. The final eradication. The moment Thorn's branded finger made contact with the burning confession, the world inverted. The pure, free-floating ember didn't consume Thorn. Instead, it was violently sucked toward his finger, attracted by its own fragment. The orange sphere of fire collapsed inward, rushing into the tiny, localized brand on Thorn's skin. The pain was not just physical, it was cosmic. Thorn felt the history of the Kilkenny family, the heat of the consumed, the rage of the injustice, and the terrified guilt of his ancestor, all flood into him at once. He heard the final, collective scream of the black fog, a sound of ultimate, violent extinction, before everything went utterly, terrifyingly silent. Thorn collapsed to the ash-covered floor, the covenant and the journal now completely consumed by the flames, but consumed after the truth was physically unwritten by the bloodline's hand. Reyes rushed to him, frantically checking his vital signs. "Detective, your hand." Thorn looked at his right index finger. The intense orange brand was gone. The skin was scarred, blistered, and scorched, but the supernatural heat had vanished. It was now just cold, dead flesh. The ember had been extinguished. The farmhouse was silent. The air was cool, smelling faintly of clean, damp earth, the scent of the covenant entity's influence, now that the lie was neutralized. Thorn pushed himself up, his body trembling, the psychic pressure gone. The black fog, the ember, the haunting force of erasure, it was gone. The debt had been paid by the descendants' final act of truth. The silence of the witness. They left the farmhouse, the original covenant consumed by the fire, the ancestors' journal destroyed. The lie was unwritten. Thorn and Reyes drove straight to the St. Jude's Regional Psychiatric Facility. They found Samuel Kilkenny in his room, sitting calmly on his bed. The distant, terrified look was gone. He looked quiet, confused, and profoundly empty. "Mr. Kilkenny?" Reyes asked softly. Samuel looked at her, then at Thorn, his eyes clear but blank. "I'm sorry, officer. I don't know why I'm here. I don't remember any fire. I don't remember a black fog. I don't remember any of it." The final payment was complete. The black fog had been a force of erasure, and in its final act, by being destroyed, it had achieved its primary goal. It consumed the only remaining living witness, Samuel Kilkenny's memory of the betrayal. The lie was unwritten, and the truth was now forgotten by everyone but Thorn and Reyes. The threat was gone, the curse lifted, but the cost was the historical record itself. The case was closed, but the horror remained. Thorn looked down at his scarred, cold finger, the memory of the ember still vivid in his mind. There was only one piece left. How would Blackwood Creek and Precinct 413 deal with the impossible, forgotten history they had just survived? Weeks passed in the sterile, fluorescent hum of Precinct 413. The media storm over the unprecedented industrial accidents and isolated disappearances in Blackwood Creek had blown over, leaving behind only confused murmurs and hastily prepared insurance paperwork. Detective Thorne and Officer Reyes sat at their desks, surrounded by files that were meticulously crafted fabrications. Mrs. Alcott and Mr. Jenkins were categorized as victims of a transient, organized crime operation specializing in historical document theft, later presumed dead. The county records annex was a gas leak. The meat packing plant was a coolant malfunction. The shattered obsidian remains of the black fog, the frozen evidence of a sentient historical curse, were quietly disposed of as non-hazardous, high-density industrial waste, buried deep under concrete in a landfill miles away. Thorne was officially on medical leave for severe frostbite and second-degree burns to his right hand. The truth was far simpler. The finger that bore the ember was now dead, numb, and permanently scarred, a cold white brand where the orange heat had once blazed. "The reports are clean, Detective," Reyes said, her voice flat, devoid of its former skepticism or even its recent terror. "The truth has been officially unwritten. Nobody remembers the six-fingered handprint. Nobody remembers the black fog. Except us," Thorne replied, looking down at his inert finger. "We are the sole, living archive of the Covenant." The town's silence. The most chilling consequence was not the physical evidence they had hidden, but the town's absolute silence regarding the cause of the events. Blackwood Creek had collectively forgotten the core fear. The locals still whispered about this spooky old Kilkenny Farm, but the specific, terrifying details, the fire, the six fingers, the sound of the sucking, were gone from the collective folklore, replaced by vague, generic ghost stories. Samuel Kilkenny, released from St. Jude's with no memory of his trauma, was relocated to a quiet retirement home. He was a man without history, an empty slate, the black fog's ultimate, final consumption. The lie was gone, but so was the truth it contained. Thorne felt a profound, unsettling guilt. He had saved the town, but he had erased its witness and its unique history, fulfilling the fog's ultimate goal of archival destruction. Reyes, witnessing the mental blankness of the town and Samuel, became quieter, more withdrawn. She started working in the Historical Archives unit full-time, a silent guardian of the official, sanitized record, perpetually checking the dates and names, terrified that some forgotten detail might reignite the curse. The lingering trace. One rainy afternoon, weeks after the events, Thorne found himself alone in Precinct 413. He was looking at the original 1983 evidence photo of the Kilkenny Farm fire damage, the last piece of true evidence that survived the fog's purge. The photo showed the scorched living room, taken before the place was boarded up. He noticed a tiny detail he'd overlooked before. On the mantelpiece, barely visible through the smoke, was a small, ceramic mug that had survived the flames. He looked at the image, then down at his scarred, cold finger, the one that had touched the ember. Thorne then reached for his own personal mug, the one he'd used every day for the last 10 years at Precinct 413. It was a cheap, white ceramic mug, chipped and stained from countless cups of bad coffee. He held the mug and compared it to the photo. They were identical. The small, ceramic mug on the mantelpiece of the long-dead Kilkenny family, sitting there the night the black fog first attacked in 1983, was the same model, the same design, as the mug Thorne drank from every day. It was a mass-produced item, but the coincidence was chilling. Thorne dismissed it as chance. He put the mug down and went to grab his jacket. As he walked past the water cooler, he paused. The intense cold that emanated from the unsealed well of the Covenant had always been associated with an old, earthy smell. But the ember, the destructive fire, was associated with the smell of ozone, burnt sugar, and scorched metal. He sniffed the air near his desk. The room was cold, quiet, and ordinary. Yet, a subtle, faint scent lingered around his workspace, a scent that shouldn't be there. It wasn't the ozone of the fog, but something else, something organic. He walked to the window, watching the rain hammer the pavement. the same relentless rain that started it all. He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out the single piece of evidence he had kept, a small, dark shard of the flash-frozen black fog that had hit his coat when the bell shattered the entity. He kept it in a tiny, specialized, insulated vial.